Containerized weapons are far more terrifying than most people can even imagine, and if you think of a rusty steel box as nothing more than freight and furniture, you are dangerously comfortable in your ignorance. Picture instead a hidden mobile arsenal that looks like a shipping container from the outside and behaves like a sovereign weapons system on the inside. Cruise missiles folded into transport frames, swarms of autonomous drones tucked into foam-lined racks, anti-air batteries packed with all the electronics needed to blind radars, torpedoes and naval mines concealably rigged for rapid deployment, and even towering physical barriers compacted into modular segments. What I'm describing is not science fiction, but a concept that turns ordinary trade infrastructure into a battlefield and turns ports, railheads, and highways into potential launch points for devastation. And that is why this is not a drill, but a paradigm shift. The future of conflict is no longer about holding the highest peak or the largest fleet. It's about who can hide capability in plain sight and then activate that capability at the precise moment when the world thinks nothing unusual is happening. Which is why every container yard, every intermodal hub, every seemingly mundane cargo operation becomes a vector of existential risk. Imagine the psychological effect alone. One rogue activation, one covert shipment reaching a high-value target, and the shockwave through markets, politics, and public confidence would be seismic. Yet the mechanics of this threat are simple to state and fiendishly hard to counter, because modern global trade depends on speed, opacity, and trust. And containerization was invented to make logistics efficient, not to serve as an invitation for asymmetric warfare. But efficiency can be weaponized, and when it is, national borders, customs protocols, and conventional military defenses are left playing catch-up to a new form of deception that is industrial in scale and surgical in execution, which means the old playbook, blockades, base defense, ship tracking, becomes inadequate overnight, while the world scrambles to invent policies that balance commerce with vigilance. Let's be blunt. The most frightening aspect is not the hardware, it is the strategic calculus. Secrecy plus mobility plus plausible deniability equals a weapon system tailor-made for today's hybrid wars. And in hybrid wars, information and surprise are as deadly as a high explosive. So when a container disguised as humanitarian aid or commercial electronics rolls calmly into port and no one inspects it beyond a routine scan, the risk equation shifts in favor of those willing to weaponize normalcy. And because advanced nations rely heavily on complex supply chains that cross multiple jurisdictions, the logistical friction that once deterred covert operations has been replaced by a web of opportunities for bad actors to seed chaos where oversight is thinnest. And this is why security experts are sleepless with scenarios that used to live only on whiteboards. What if a dozen containers at different ports are simultaneously triggered to deploy drone swarms over critical infrastructure during a hurricane that overloads emergency services? What if a single container houses a decoy system that draws air defenses while another container, innocuous and forgotten on a rail spur, unfolds into a precision strike platform? These are not sensational hypotheticals meant to terrify for clicks. They are plausible blueprints for strategic shock, when one accepts that lethality no longer requires a sanctioned military parade or an overt fleet mobilization. Lethality can be modular, distributed, and invisible until the moment of activation, and the internet and cheap electronics have democratized capabilities that once demanded state resources, meaning a group with enough technical savvy and logistical access can convert civilian infrastructure into an offensive advantage. And this is the real nightmare for national security planners who must now consider every node of commerce as both critical infrastructure and potential ambush point. The implications ripple outward like oil on water. Insurance premiums skyrocket. Ports reroute cargo at intolerable economic cost. Supply chains fragment as companies scramble to regionalize and de-risk. Geopolitical tensions spike because any unexplained incident could be interpreted as an act of war, and the fragile norms that once constrained escalation dissolve under the weight of ambiguity. If you can't immediately determine who launched an attack, proportional response becomes a political and military minefield, and governments risk either overreacting against the wrong actor or underreacting and inviting further aggression, which is why the conversation about containerized weapons must move beyond academic curiosity and become a full-spectrum policy priority that includes intelligence, customs reform, transport regulation, cyber resilience, and new international standards for transparency and verification. Because the enemy in this new domain doesn't have to be a nation-state, and the tools of concealment and activation are cheaper and more accessible than ever before. Yes, you still need expertise to assemble and integrate weapons into shipping modules, but you don't need a billion-dollar defense budget to make a single container a delivery mechanism for destruction. And history shows that where there is motive and opportunity, innovation follows, often in asymmetric forms that classical militaries are poorly prepared to counter. So the first line of defense cannot be an upgraded gun or a bigger radar network. Those are necessary but insufficient. The first line must be smarter inspection protocols, better data fusion across customs and intelligence agencies, and pressure on the global logistics industry to adopt tamper-evident architectures and cryptographic provenance for shipments that make it radically harder to mount covert weaponization without detection. And while that may sound technocratic, the alternative is to leave entire democracies vulnerable to disruption that looks like accidents until the pattern becomes obvious. Let me illustrate with a scenario that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. A cluster of containers, all labeled as innocuous electronics and destined for different ports in allied countries, is interspersed with legitimate shipments so as to avoid statistical anomalies. Inside several of those containers, modular drone launch platforms are concealed beneath legitimate goods, with fuel cells and folded propellers designed for rapid assembly. And accompanying that hardware are spoofed logistics manifests that route maintenance crews who are actually front companies providing final assembly assistance. And because the logistics chain touches multiple legal jurisdictions, an adversary can exploit the seams. Customs in one country might lack the resources to X-ray every container. Port security in another may be overloaded after a busy trade season. And stage-set delays caused by mundane congestion give the adversary the window needed for remote activation once all the pieces are in place. And suddenly, a coordinated swarm deploys over a set of critical targets, power substations, data centers, bridges, while civilian emergency services are stretched thin by an unconnected weather event. Within minutes, cascading failures multiply. Power outages cripple communication, data centers lose redundancy and are unable to coordinate defense, and economic activity stalls. And the world wakes up to a new kind of shock that is part kinetic, part cyber, and entirely deniable until forensic evidence is properly assembled, because containerized weapons are designed to leave minimal fingerprints and maximum plausible deniability. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Fear of invisible threats induced by ordinary commerce will erode public trust in global trade and immigrant labor, feed protectionist politics, and empower political actors who favor isolationist policies. In democracies, this can produce rapid policy swings that harm long-term economic health while doing little to address the root problem, which is whether our systems are resilient to adversaries who treat civilian infrastructure as the battlefield itself. And this is why we must also think about the legal and ethical frameworks that govern surveillance and inspection. Intrusive inspection regimes that treat every container as suspect will protect security but damage privacy, commerce, and civil liberties unless carefully calibrated. And there is a delicate balance to be struck between preventing catastrophe and preserving the openness that modern economies rely on. But balancing is not the same as paralysis, and timely, coordinated action is required, because the window for meaningful reform narrows every day as technology becomes smaller, cheaper, and more lethal. This is not a theoretical exercise limited to worst-case national security conferences. Journalists, think tanks, and former intelligence officials have documented how non-state actors have already weaponized commercial platforms in limited ways. And while the details are often redacted for good reason, open-source reporting and declassified cases show a pattern. Concealment plus mobility plus low detectability equals a strategic lever that can be used for blackmail, terror, or statecraft. And potential remedies exist, but require political will and international cooperation at a scale that has become painfully rare. Imagine new standards where containers are embedded with tamper-proof sensors whose cryptographic signatures are logged to immutable ledgers and monitored in near real time, coupled with AI-driven anomaly detection systems that correlate across global shipping databases, port authority logs, and satellite imagery to flag suspicious patterns. And when combined with focused, intelligence-led interdiction instead of scattershot searching, such systems could raise the bar significantly for those intent on weaponizing commerce while protecting legitimate trade